In the late 1800s, a new empire quietly entered the global race for power. It was young, ambitious, and determined to prove itself among the world's greatest nations. Most people today remember the British or French empires when they think of colonial history, but there was another empire, one that arrived later and ruled more briefly, yet left behind one of the darkest and least talked about chapters in colonial history. This was the empire of German Empire. By the 1880s, European powers were scrambling to claim territory across Africa and the Pacific, in what historians call the Scramble for Africa. Germany, unified only in 1871, did not want to be left behind. Within just a few years, it established colonies across vast and distant lands, parts of modern-day Namibia, Tanzania, Cameroon, and Togo in Africa, and islands scattered across the Pacific Ocean. To many Germans at the time, these colonies symbolized prestige and global power. But for the people who already lived in those lands, colonial rule brought hardship, violence, and profound change. One of the most important and tragic stories comes from a region once known as German Southwest Africa, today the country of Namibia. When German settlers arrived in the late 19th century, they quickly began claiming land for farms and ranches. Indigenous communities who had lived there for generations suddenly found their grazing land shrinking. Cattle were taken, water sources were controlled. Entire communities were pushed aside as colonial authorities supported the settlers. Among the local groups were the Herero people and the Nama people. Both had deep connections to the land and strong social traditions. But tensions between them and the colonial government grew steadily as more land was seized and restrictions tightened. By 1904, frustration and anger had reached a breaking point. Herero fighters launched an uprising against German colonial forces. Their goal was simple: to reclaim their land and defend their communities. At first, they managed to surprise the German authorities. Farms and military posts were attacked, and for a moment it seemed the uprising might succeed. But Germany quickly sent reinforcements. One of the commanders sent to suppress the rebellion was Lothar von Trotha, a general known for his brutal military strategies. His response would become one of the most controversial and tragic episodes in colonial history. After defeating Herero forces at the Battle of Waterberg in 1904, von Trotha issued a chilling order. Instead of allowing survivors to surrender or return home, they were driven into the harsh desert regions of the Omaheke Desert. Water sources were blocked or guarded by German troops. Families fleeing the battlefield, men, women, and children, were forced deeper into the desert with little food or water. Many died from thirst, exhaustion, and exposure. Historians today widely recognize these events as the Herero and Nama genocide. But beyond statistics and historical records, there were human stories rarely told outside academic books. One account comes from a young Herero girl who survived the chaos by hiding with her mother during the long journey into the desert. According to later testimonies recorded by historians, the girl remembered walking for days under a burning sun while her mother searched desperately for water. At night, they listened to the cries of other families scattered across the sand. At one point, they found a small muddy pool left by recent rain. Dozens of people rushed toward it at once. The water was dirty, but for many it was the only chance to survive. The girl would eventually live long enough to tell her story decades later. But most who began that journey never returned, and the suffering did not end in the desert. Those who survived were often captured and placed in forced labor camps. One of the most notorious was located near the coastal town of Shark Island. Conditions there were extremely harsh. Prisoners were forced to work long hours building railways, roads, and infrastructure for the colonial administration. Food was scarce, shelter was minimal. Disease spread quickly through the overcrowded camp. Some historians estimate that tens of thousands of Herero and Nama people died during this period. For decades, this chapter of history remained largely overlooked outside Namibia. But in recent years, historians and governments have begun discussing it more openly. In fact, the government of Germany officially acknowledged the events as genocide in 2021 after long negotiations with Namibia. Yet the story of the German colonial empire is not only about tragedy, it is also about how global politics, ambition, and competition between European powers shaped distant regions of the world. At the same time, Germany controlled territory in Namibia. It also ruled large areas of East Africa known as German East Africa, which included parts of modern Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi. Here, too, local resistance emerged. One of the most dramatic uprisings occurred between 1905 and 1907, in what became known as the Maji Maji Rebellion. The rebellion began when local communities united against forced labor and heavy taxation imposed by colonial authorities. Fighters believed a sacred water, called Maji, would protect them from bullets, which is how the rebellion got its name. Despite their courage, the uprising was eventually crushed by German forces. Famine and destruction followed as crops were burned and villages destroyed during the conflict. Far from Africa, Germany also built an empire across the Pacific Ocean. Islands, such as German New Guinea and Samoa, became strategic outposts for trade and naval power. Many people today don't realize that before World War I, Germany controlled one of the largest colonial networks in the world. But unlike the British or French empires, it did not last very long. Everything changed in 1914 with the outbreak of World War I. When war erupted in Europe, Germany's colonies suddenly became targets for Allied forces. British, French, Japanese, and other troops quickly moved to capture them. Within a few years, Germany had lost nearly all its overseas territories. After the war ended in 1918, the Treaty of Versailles officially stripped Germany of its colonies. They were divided among other powers under international mandates. In less than 40 years, the German colonial empire had risen and disappeared. But its legacy did not disappear. The stories of the Herero and Nama people, the uprisings in East Africa, and the lives forever changed by colonial rule remain part of the historical memory of those regions. Today in Namibia, memorials and museums remember the victims of the genocide. Descendants of survivors continue to share family histories passed down through generations. These voices remind us that history is not only about empires and borders, it is also about the people whose lives were shaped by those events. And sometimes, the most important stories are the ones that were almost forgotten.